presumption is that to account for effects, it is not enough simply to cite a law according to which they occur. We must also be able to point to some fact about the nature of the subject of the effect, which explains how and why that effect occurs as it does. In addressing this question, we must begin from Leibniz's axiom that substance is the ground of all force or power in the created world. By definition, substance is an intrinsic principle of action or change. Substances, material or immaterial, Leibniz says, cannot be conceived in their bare essence devoid of activity. Activity is of the essence of substance in general. For this reason, Leibniz believes that all explanations of natural change must terminate in an account of how those changes occur through the exercise of powers intrinsic to substances. That is the ultimate reason why anything happens in the way it does in nature. Granting this, we confront two further questions. For Leibniz, what are the members of the class of genuine substances, the fundamental sources of activity in the world? And second, how is the exercise of the powers of those substances linked explanatorily to the occurrence of physical phenomena? A dominant theme of Leibniz's philosophy from the late 1670s onward is that the latter explanatory work cannot be accomplished if we limit ourselves to the understanding of nature presupposed by the mechanical philosophy, an understanding according to which the properties of bodies are restricted to extension and its passive modifications, including impenetrability and solidity. There is much to say on this topic. Much has been said on this topic. For my purposes, we need accept only 2 points. First, as conceived by the mechanical philosophy, bodies fail to meet the conditions Leibniz imposes on a substantial existence. They just can't be substances. Bodies as conceived by the mechanical philosophy, they lack a true unity as Leibniz understands it, and they lack an intrinsic principle of activity. Second, the natures of bodies as conceived by the mechanical philosophy are inadequate to account for the effects observed in them, according to Leibniz. In particular, Leibniz stresses effects associated with the motion and collision of bodies. His major claim here is that the fundamental law of the conservation of force cannot be accounted for if the nature of body is limited to extension and its passive modifications. And Dan talked a bit about this yesterday. A characteristic statement of Leibniz's reasoning on this topic appears in the Specimen Dynamicum of 1695. After reflecting on the inadequacy of his own original conception of body, Leibniz writes, and this is passage 5, I found a proof that something more than magnitude and impenetrability must be assumed in body, from which an interpretation of forces may arise. By adding the metaphysical laws of this factor to the laws of extension, there arise those rules of motion which I would call systematic, namely that all change occurs gradually, that every change involves a reaction, that no new force is produced without diminishing the earlier force, and that there is neither more nor less power in the effect than in the cause. Since this law is not derived from the concept of mass or bulk, molus, it must follow from something else which is in bodies, namely from the force itself, which always preserves the same quantity, even though it is used by different bodies. I concluded, therefore, that besides purely mathematical principles subject to the imagination, there must be omitted certain metaphysical principles perceptible only to the mind, and that a certain higher and, so to speak, formal principle must be added to that of material mass. Whether we call this principle form, entelechy, or force does not matter, provided that we remember that it is explained intelligibly only through the concept of force, concept of forces. Leibniz's argument here draws both on the general principle of the intelligibility of nature and on the specific claim that certain physical effects demand a ground in a principle of force or power. The true laws of motion, particularly the conservation of force, cannot be explained in terms of the concepts of extension and impenetrability alone. Hence, something more must be present in the nature of body, a formal or metaphysical principle which is perceptible only to the mind. The link to intelligibility is made explicit in the opening of the Specimen Dynamicum. Leibniz writes, we have suggested elsewhere that there is something besides extension in corporeal things, indeed that there is something prior to extension, a force of nature implanted everywhere by the author of nature. But if we cannot ascribe it to God by some miracle, it is certainly necessary that this force be produced by him within bodies themselves. Indeed, it must constitute the inmost nature of the bodies, since it is the character of substance to act, and extension means only the continuation or diffusion of an already presupposed acting and resisting substance. The claim that there must be a force of nature implanted everywhere in bodies leads directly to the conclusion that this force constitutes the inmost nature of body for Leibniz. Connecting these two ideas is the axiom that substance, the most basic form of reality, is itself a principle of action or force. If bodies are real, their existence must be explained in terms of the existence of substance. From this is a short step for Leibniz to conclude that if force belongs to the nature of body, then that force is just the force of whatever substances ground the body's existence. The relationship between the physical force of bodies and the principle of force constitutive of substance is fundamental to Leibniz's philosophy, absolutely fundamental. One of the hurdles to comprehending this relationship is Leibniz's assertion that substantial force or power is to be interpreted in broadly Aristotelian terms as soul or substantial form. Again, in the Specimen Dynamicum, he writes, and this is passage 6, active force, which may not inappropriately be called power, as some do, is twofold. That is either primitive, which is in all corporeal substances as such, one could just read all material substances, or derivative, which is exercised variously, as it were by a limitation of primitive force, resulting from the collision of bodies with one another. Indeed, primitive force, which is nothing but the first entelechy, or primary primitive entelechy, corresponds to soul or substantial form. And for that reason, it pertains only to general causes which are insufficient to explain the phenomena. And so we agree with those who deny that we should appeal to forms when treating the individual and specific causes of sensible things. This is worth pointing out so that when we restore forms as if by birthright, in order to uncover the ultimate causes of things, at the same time we don't seem to want to revive the empty wordplay of the common schools. Nevertheless, a conception of forms is necessary for philosophizing properly. Leibniz conceives of substantial power or primitive force as essential to the nature of material being, and is grounding the force exerted by bodies in motion and collision. Yet he denies that this force, as soul or substantial form, can be appealed to in providing explanations of particular physical phenomena. Distancing himself from scholastic Aristotelians and from those who, he says, bring forth attractive, retentive, repulsive, directive, expansive, and contractive faculties as the proximate causes of phenomena, Leibniz allies himself with the research program of the mechanical philosophy while also marking out what he takes to be its explanatory limits. As he succinctly puts it, we must suppose that, quote, everything happens mechanically in nature, but that the principles of mechanism are metaphysical. The distinction Leibniz draws here allows us to contrast the implications he sees as following from the principle of intelligibility and from the requirement that any instance of force have a ground in some substantial power. Leibniz takes the demand for intelligibility to rule against any putative explanation of physical change that is not given in terms of forces exercised through body-body contact. In his view, it is unintelligible how one extended body can affect another except through physical contact with it. To this extent, the program of mechanistic physics is upheld. That physics, which explains everything in the nature of body through number, measure, weight, or size, shape, and motion, which teaches that nothing is moved naturally except through contact and motion, and so teaches that in physics everything happens mechanically, that is, intelligibly, this physics seems excessively clear and straightforward. Okay, so it's right from the point of view explaining how force is exercised, always through contact. At the same time, mechanistic physics is judged to be incomplete as an account of the physical forces exercised by one body on another. These forces and the laws governing them cannot be explained in terms of size, shape, and motion, but presuppose something additional in matter, a substantial form, primitive force, or entelechy, which is the ground of the forces exerted in motion and collision. Unfortunately, to say all this is merely to set the stage for the deepest problems that confront the interpretation of Leibniz's position. Bodies appear to gain and lose derivative force through motion and through contact with other bodies. Those forces, however, claim a ground in reality as modifications of the active powers of souls or substantial forms. The unification of this set of doctrines poses an extraordinary challenge for Leibniz, to which he responded in at least two different ways. Structurally, the two counts are closely related, though most commentators have seen them as inconsistent from an ontological point of view. The first account responds to the incompleteness of the mechanistic theory of matter by replacing it with a conception of matter as consisting of infinitely enveloped living bodies or corporeal substances, or as Dan said a long time ago, quasi-Aristotelian corporeal substances. On this understanding of matter, the forces exercised by bodies in motion are explained as modifications of primitive active forces, which themselves are identified with the forms of the constitutive corporeal substances. A second approach goes beyond this, conceiving of the substances that constitute matter, if there be such substances, as unextended soul-like monads. Monads, like corporeal substances, are endowed, Leibniz says, with primitive active and passive powers, that is, substantial form and primary matter. Hence, we should expect Leibniz to pursue exactly the same pattern of explanation in this case. The derivative forces of moving bodies are accounted for as modifications of the primitive active powers of the substances constitutive of those bodies, i.e., of monads. On the face of it, it might seem that the first account is more promising simply because it is more firmly rooted in terra firma. The substances that ground the reality of corporeal forces are themselves corporeal. Everyone likes that idea. I remain unconvinced by this for two reasons. That is, that there's a really explanatory advantage in this case. First, both accounts face the same basic challenge of explaining, of rendering intelligible how derivative forces like vis viva arise as modifications of a soul-like substantial form. Although the soul or form is conceived as metaphysically united with the body in one case and not in the other, this difference does not make it any easier to understand how derivative forces, derivative physical forces, arise as modifications of its primitive active force. I think you have exactly the same challenge to understanding in both cases. Second, I believe that Leibniz actually has more interesting, or at least more intriguing things to say about this issue of explanation in the case of monads, and that the account he gives allows us to see some of the explanatory strength of the monological metaphysics. I shall return to the details of this account in the last section of my paper. First, however, I want to lay out the general strategy Leibniz develops for explaining the modifications of active force and why this sends us from powers back to laws. Whether physical forces are conceived as modifications of the active powers of a corporeal substance or as modifications of the active power of an immaterial substance, Leibniz faces the same basic question. Under what circumstances and through what causes is a substantial power activated or actualized as this or that moment of force? The metaphysical issues here are subtle, and they nowhere receive the careful, extended treatment they deserve from Leibniz. Leibniz defines change, mutatio, or as I have it here, transitio, and this is passage 7, as nothing but a complex of two states which are immediate and opposite to each other, together with a force, or reason for the change, which reason itself is a quality. There are lots of definitions like this. I cite some of them in another paper, Leibniz on Spontaneity. This one is a little bit different. It's useful for my purposes, but I think it's representative. This definition involves several elements. First, change itself is not a state of a thing, but a complex or aggregate of a pair of contradictory states. Second, a point that remains implicit in this definition, these states are ordered as prior and posterior, and there is a reason why the one succeeds the other. Third, this reason is a force which itself is a quality of the thing, or more specifically, a quality of the prior state. The force of the prior state is a sufficient reason for the existence of the subsequent state. For Leibniz, this account of change, I should say a sufficient reason, the force of the state plus whatever the laws might turn out to be. We'll get to that. Okay. What remains less than perspicuous in this account is how the force associated, I missed a paragraph. For Leibniz, this account of change is meant to be completely general. It is applicable to the changes that bodies undergo, but equally it should apply to changes in the states of substances, including monads. This is important because if Leibniz's explanatory program is to succeed, changes in the physical states of bodies, which are accounted for through the forces acting on and in them, must ultimately be explained in terms of the transient modifications of substantial forms or primitive active powers. So the account has to apply to substances as well, and Leibniz clearly believes this is true for monads. At any moment, a monad is defined by a perceptual state, the representation of the manifold in a unity. Such perceptual states succeed one another in change, and the succession of states is explained by the force associated with the prior perceptual state. What remains less than perspicuous is how the force associated with the momentary changing states of a substance is grounded in the primitive active power that defines the nature of a substance. On this point, it is helpful to consider Leibniz's position from the perspective of Aristotle's account of change, although I'm not going to say much about this. For Aristotle, Any substance has a given power or potential to be modified by certain qualities or accidents, for example, to be white or to be large.